I think I was watching your video and you said that there are 3 distinct types of building in that area.
That's right.
What are those 3?
So yeah, it's there. There's and this does exist globally as well, I'd say. But this is I have to credit Jesus Gamarra and his father Alfredo, who are indigenous Peruvian researchers, been researching the Sacred Valley sites for more than 50 years. Who really came up with the nomenclature and the classification of this architecture. I think they're spot on. But you always see these 3 layers. They're in the same layers in terms of the older stuff's at the bottom. You have megalithic stuff on top, and then the Inca work on the top. But at the bottom, it's something called Hanan Pacha. I describe it as the monolithic kind of living rock. This is the carved bedrock. Some people describe them as Inca thrones, you see, shaped, carved into the bedrock itself. There's all sorts of strange shapes. There's like curved shapes, like almost like as if it was melted and the water was running. You have places like, Kenko, Zone X, Temple of the Moon, all of these sites around Cusco itself that exhibit this type of work. It's at Sacsayhuaman, it's at Ollantaytambo. You can even find it at Machu Picchu and all these other places. And that's like the what seems to be the oldest layer. In a lot of places like Kenko and the Temple of the Moon, it just seems tremendously ancient, very eroded, like noticeably more eroded, and just looks weathered and ancient relative to everything else. And built on top of that, you will find what's called as Uran Pacha, which is the very classic, famous kind of megalithic, polygonal, cellular work, right? So this is the walls of Sacsayhuaman, or the big the big walls in the streets of Cusco. This is that really precisely done, no mortar between them, really big stones, all generally of the same stone type, classical megalithic architecture, very similar to things we see in Egypt and in Turkey and in Easter Island and other places around the world. You have that layer, and often you'll see that it's almost gently built on top of or around the Hanan Pacha architecture. It's like there's this theme of circular protection, as if they were respectful and they were like protecting the more ancient architecture. And then on top of that, and you see this everywhere, you see the Inca repair work, and in Jesus' system, it's called Ikun Pacha. And that's the Inca work, which is like small local stones, cobblestones, just local rocks. It's a mishmash of different rocks, usually often used with mud mortar, and obviously different, much more primitive style of architecture. And this is the work that the Inca does. It matches kind of the terracing that the Inca did. They would build these tremendous terraces for farming. And it certainly matches what we know of their technological capabilities as a civilization. And, I mean, there's even accounts from those early Spanish conquistadors and some of the guys that were writing down accounts of them seeing the Inca trying to repair and reuse this more megalithic stuff. So but the Inca would do the same thing. They clearly respected and built upon those earlier styles, and they followed those same themes of like a circular protection, and they would repair things where they could. And some of the the evidence that they weren't building this stuff is shown by when they couldn't find where like a big megalithic stone would go, they would use it in their walls. Like a lot of the lentil stones above doorways, for example, are typically like a megalithic stone that came. It's a different stone type. It's bigger and better made, and it came from somewhere else, and they'd reuse that. I think those are the 3 styles, and as I said, you can find those styles to lesser or greater degrees pretty much all around the world. I mean, it's very stark in Peru and the Sacred Valley. You can see the difference. It just hits you in the face, because the Inca as a civilization weren't, it was 150, 200 years old. It wasn't a very long-lived culture before the Spanish came in and destroyed it. But in Egypt, like, you have this 3,000 plus year civilization that over time, obviously developed significant capabilities for stonework. So those lines get a bit more blurred. Like, they became very, very good at what they did, and they did just incredible things with stone. So, defining that difference between like what's megalithic, what's beyond their capability versus what can a giant sort of 3,000-year-old powerful civilization achieve over time, it's a bit tougher to tell. But in South America and the Sacred Valley, it's once you see those layers and you see the way that the Inca repaired stuff, it's super obvious.
I see what you're saying. So in the Incan situation, it's very distinct, these layers.
Yeah.
They're very separated.
Yeah.
But in Egypt, it's a little more muddled, but I remember seeing what you're talking about in Egypt. It seemed like the deeper we went and the older we got, the bigger the stones and the more precise and heavier they were.
Yeah, it's one of the contradictions.
So, yeah, Egypt had a couple contradictions, and I think your idea on the tale of two industries, it just hit me so hard because it's like, yeah, we're looking at two very distinct styles of building here.
Yeah.
So I'd love to get into that with you today.
Yeah, I mean, it's been an observation that I've made, based on all these years of research. In that it's not just sort of architecture. I think that tale of two industries where you have one industry that very much matches what we know of in terms of, and we're talking Egypt specifically here, but it matches the capabilities and technological, prowess of that civilization, right? Because we know what they did and how they worked, because they've had depictions of it. They drew scenes on the walls that show them working different materials, showed them using different tools. We found a lot of the tools that they used, although not by no means all of the ones that they think they used. And there's artifacts and architecture that match those capabilities, right? So we see boxes made like this, vases, columns, architecture, slabs, statues, this type of thing, that very much match this sort of handmade Bronze Age, relatively primitive manufacturing capability. But then there's a whole category of these same types of artifacts that really don't. And these are these, giant megalithic structures, the Valley Temple, the Mortuary Temple, in some cases, certainly aspects of the pyramids, statues, vases, columns, boxes, these things. There are examples of these things that are just mind-bendingly precise and it really boggles the mind as to how these things were made, how they were moved, and they really don't match the capabilities and the technological ability of a Bronze Age culture like that. And nobody's ever really proven that you can, in fact, make these things with those primitive methodologies. In fact, the only way that we could do a lot of these things today would be to use, our very best machine tools and computer-guided manufacturing plants and CNC mills and things like this. And they're made from crazy materials like granite or diorite or extremely hard andesitic stone, stuff like that, or other types of just frankly ridiculous material. And they scale up in size to, 1,000 tons or more. Like there are artifacts that in the 200, 300, 400, 600, 800, and over 1,000 tons. And there's like probably dozens of these examples that you can point to in Egypt. And so I think there's, I'm a little careful about what I say definitely can't be done by the dynastic Egyptians, because you don't really want to underestimate their capability. But at a high level, I break it down into a couple of different categories. One is the evidence for advanced types of machining, and we see this at places like Abu Sir. We see it on statues and columns, obelisks, and boxes, where you have tool marks. Right, you have tool marks for these tools that we can't really explain within the context of a Bronze Age civilization. Things like tubular drills that show just a remarkable penetration rate into the stone based on the spiral striations that we see on both the cores and the walls of these tubular drill holes. In other areas, we see things like circular saw cuts or straight saw cuts going at a rapid rate through material like granite or basalt. And some of the diameters, if you extrapolate kind of the curvature of some of these blades, you're talking like 30 feet. With some of them huge tools that are evidently cutting, and very thin too, because some of them have kerfs where they were cutting. Very thin tools that cut right through this material. And then there's another category which really relates to precision and symmetry. And it's hard to eyeball that sort of stuff. It really does need to be measured and studied. And that's been the conclusion with the work that's happened in 2023 around the vase scanning that I've been documenting on my channel, where we've taken some of these pre-dynastic artifacts. That's the other thing. A lot of these precision artifacts actually predate the dynastic civilization. And we've been inspecting them using modern metrology tools, things like structured light scanners, CT X-ray scanners that give you a extremely accurate model of these artifacts down to like the thousandths of an inch, or in some cases down to the micron with the CT X-ray. And then you can go into GD&T kind of tools that are, geometric tolerance and design tools where you can now analyze things like concentricity, roundness, surface flatness, symmetry, and essentially look at the precision within which this thing was made. And we're seeing these remarkable results where, your average deviation on the surface of some of these vases might be within 1,000th or 2,000ths of an inch, which is, a human hair is between 2 and 3,000ths of an inch thick. And we've also looked at these tools in precision manufacturing workshops, put them on rotating tables and put like these tolerance gauges against them. We did a whole inspection day out at Danville Metal Stamping with Chris Dunn and the Vase Scan team, and we were inspecting a bunch of these artifacts, and it's truly remarkable results, and certainly not anything that can be achieved by hand by people like rubbing on them with sticks and rocks and sand, which is kind of how they're explained in the story. This is one of the big mysteries. And we see similar things, and Chris Dunn has done some good work looking at symmetry in statues and things like that too, and seeing perfect symmetry is also an indication of precision. So that's another category of artifacts that I think sit outside of the capability of the known Bronze Age civilization. And then the last category that I kind of put these artifacts into is really got more to do with logistics. So anything I would say above about 200 tons is a significant challenge to suggest that an artifact that weighs more than around 200 tons, it could be more, could be less, but that's sort of an area. I think it's very difficult to explain how those things could have been moved. The long distances that they were moved, in fact, we've got examples of like 1,000-ton artifacts being moved 1,000 kilometers or more, and then put up and put into place wherever they are. And there's dozens of these examples. I'd also put into that category things like the Serapeum boxes, which are these 100-ton, granite or syenite massive boxes that are in this underground labyrinth where you literally have about a foot of clearance between the walls of the, these tunnels, these underground tunnels, and the width of the boxes. Now you might be able to move a 100-ton object around with enough people above ground, but moving those things around in those tight tunnels and those small spaces underground is a whole other ballpark. And it's, again, these are not any questions that have really been answered by demonstration. Like I'm not saying that I know how it was done, but I'm very skeptical that it was done with these primitive methodologies. And anyone claiming that they do know how it was done or it was done with primitive methodologies, it's kind of on them to prove it, to go and prove it. And as far as I know, nobody ever has. As you said, like the older you go, kind of the better and the bigger the work becomes. I mean, people forget that the pyramids, the big stone pyramids, the Great Pyramids, they're amongst the first pyramids supposedly ever built, and it's as if these they appeared out of nowhere and peaked with all of these capabilities and then slid downhill over time. And that's just not the way technological progression works. I mean, look at our society. Like we didn't go from the space shuttle to the horse and cart, but we're expected to believe that that's kind of the progression that happened in ancient Egypt, and it doesn't make sense to me. I think there's another context under which these mysteries make a lot more sense, and that is longer timelines. Lost civilizations that had a greater capability and inherited artifacts, even inherited culture, and inherited architecture and sites that were then occupied and reused and renovated and built upon for thousands of years. And that's kind of the lens you've got to look at this stuff through and try and puzzle it out. And I do think that context, in light of all of the evidence, not to mention the evidence that comes from fields outside of archaeology and Egyptology, genetics, climate science, catastrophism, the extension of the human timelines, all of these things, I think all of that is supporting evidence that makes this a much more plausible hypothesis for what we're seeing.